Chapter 1. Whispers among the shelves. The bells above the door jingled softly, a sound so faint it barely stirred Elias from his routine. Behind the counter of his small bookstore, he sat hunched over a ledger, meticulously noting down the dwindling sales of the week. The store was dimly lit, illuminated only by the weak sunlight filtering through the grime-coated windows and the scattered glow of old lamps. Dust motes swirled in the air like tiny phantoms, dancing to a melody only they could hear. Elias liked it this way, quiet, predictable, undisturbed. The world outside could churn and roar, but in this sanctuary of paper and ink, time stood still. That is, until the bell jingled again. Its sound sharp and clear this time. Elias sighed, glancing toward the door, expecting the usual customer. An old professor, perhaps, or a harried student clutching a list of required reading. Instead, he saw her. She was a burst of color against the muted tones of the shop. A red scarf trailed from her neck, and her coat was the bright green of spring leaves, a shade so incongruous in the gray winter afternoon that it almost hurt to look at. Her hair, a tumble of chestnut waves, framed a face lit with curiosity and warmth. She paused just inside the door, breathing in deeply as if the very air of the shop held secrets waiting to be unraveled. Elias's first instinct was annoyance. Customers like her were rare in his store, and for good reason. This wasn't a place for casual browsers or those seeking light entertainment. The shelves groaned under the weight of obscure tomes, rare editions, and books long out of print, a collection curated over decades to cater to the serious and the studious. But she didn't seem deterred by the somber atmosphere. If anything, her smile widened as she stepped further inside. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice lilting, as if she were speaking in a melody. Her eyes darted from shelf to shelf, and she clasped her hands together in delight. "This place is wonderful." Elias didn't reply immediately. He'd learned long ago that enthusiasm like hers burned bright but faded quickly, often leaving behind nothing but an unpaid bill and a mess of misplaced books. "Can I help you find something?" he asked finally, his tone clipped. She turned to him, her expression undimmed by his brusqueness. "Not yet. I'd like to explore first, if that's all right." "Suit yourself," Elias muttered, returning his attention to the ledger. He didn't watch her as she wandered, though he caught glimpses of her reflection in the glass of a nearby display case. She moved with the care of someone who respected the space, her fingers brushing spines as if greeting old friends. Every now and then, she would pause to pull a book from the shelf, cradling it as she read the back cover or flipped through its pages. Minutes stretched into an hour, and Elias began to wonder if she had gotten lost among the labyrinthine rows. He stood, the creak of his chair breaking the silence, and followed the faint rustling of pages. He found her in a corner of the store that few ventured into, seated on a stool with a book open in her lap. Her expression was one of rapture, her lips moving silently as she read. "That's not a library," he said gruffly, crossing his arms. The words came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't bother softening them. She looked up, startled, but her smile returned almost immediately. "I'm sorry," she said, closing the book gently. "I couldn't help myself. It's been so long since I've seen a first edition of Leaves of Grass. I couldn't resist." Elias blinked. Few customers recognized the treasures hidden in his shop without guidance, let alone sought them out. "You know Whitman?" he asked, the edge in his voice softening slightly. "Know him? I adore him," she replied, rising to her feet and holding the book as if it were sacred. "His words feel alive, don't they? Like they're still breathing, still waiting to be heard." For a moment, Elias didn't know how to respond. Her passion was disarming, and he found himself at a loss for his usual sarcastic retorts. Instead, he extended a hand toward the book. "May I?" She hesitated, then handed it over. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Elias felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He examined the book, its worn leather cover familiar under his touch. "This is a valuable addition," he said, his tone cautious. "Most people wouldn't even recognize it." "I'm not most people," she said with a grin. Clearly, Elias muttered, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward despite himself. He handed the book back to her. "You've got good taste. Just don't damage it." "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied, cradling the book once more. "By the way, I'm Clara." "Elias," he said after a pause, his name feeling strange on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd introduced himself to a customer. "It's nice to meet you, Elias," Clara said, her smile as bright as her coat. "I think I'll take this one if that's all right." He nodded, leading her back to the counter to ring up the purchase. As he watched her leave, the red scarf trailing behind her like a comet's tail, Elias felt the stillness of the shop settle around him once more. But this time, it didn't feel comforting. It felt empty. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside, and returned to his ledger. Customers came and went. That was the nature of his business. But something told him that Clara wouldn't be like the others. She'd left a mark, faint but undeniable, like a whisper among the shelves. Chapter 2. A Dance of Ink and Fire. The days after Clara's visit unfolded much as they always did in Elias's bookstore. The sun rose reluctantly over the narrow street, its weak light barely piercing the grime-coated windows. Regular customers drifted in like familiar ghosts, nodding their greetings and vanishing into the shelves, only to emerge an hour later with their treasures clutched to their chests. Elias remained at his post behind the counter, his ledger open, though he found himself distracted more often than usual. He hadn't expected her to return. Customers like Clara rarely did. Her exuberance and charm belonged to a different world, one filled with sunshine, chatter, and lively book clubs where stories were devoured with coffee and laughter. This shop, with its dim corners and solemn atmosphere, seemed an ill fit for someone so vibrant. But return she did. It was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind where the hours felt as heavy as the dust on the shelves. The doorbell jingled, breaking the silence, and Elias looked up, his pen still poised over the ledger. There she was, her red scarf wound snugly around her neck, her cheeks flushed from the chill outside. This time, she carried a canvas tote bag, its straps straining against what appeared to be several books. "Hello again," she said brightly, stepping into the shop as if it were a friend's home. Her eyes immediately began scanning the shelves. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by." "It's a bookstore," Elias replied gruffly. "Not much point if people don't drop by." Clara laughed, a sound as warm and unexpected as the first sip of mulled cider. "Fair enough," she said, making her way to the counter. She set the tote bag down with a gentle thud. "I brought these for you. They're duplicates from my collection, and I thought you might find a place for them here." Elias blinked, caught off guard. He eyed the bag suspiciously, then reached in to pull out the topmost book. It was a hardcover edition of Jane Eyre, its spine uncreased and its pages pristine. Beneath it were several more titles, equally well preserved. He flipped one open, the faint scent of fresh paper wafting up. These were not the cast-offs of someone merely clearing space on their shelves. These were cherished possessions. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice edged with suspicion. Clara shrugged, her expression unbothered by his tone. "Because books should be shared. Isn't that what you believe, too? Otherwise, why run a bookstore?" Elias's mouth opened, then closed. He had no ready reply. Instead, he placed the book carefully on the counter and busied himself arranging the others into a neat stack. "They'll do," he said gruffly. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Clara said, her smile undimmed. "Now, Do you mind if I look around again? I'm in the mood for something adventurous this time. Elias waved a hand toward the shelves. Knock yourself out. She wandered deeper into the store, her movements unhurried and deliberate. As the minutes ticked by, Elias found his attention straying from the ledger more often than not. He watched as she examined titles, occasionally tilting her head as if listening to the books whisper their stories. Every so often, she would pluck one from the shelf and cradle it in her hands, her face lighting up as if she'd uncovered a hidden treasure. By the time she returned to the counter, her arms were full. She set the stack down with a triumphant flourish, her cheeks glowing from exertion. I think I've outdone myself this time, she said with a laugh. Elias's brows lifted as he scanned the titles. They ranged from a dog-eared copy of the Odyssey to an illustrated guide on the history of lighthouses. An interesting mix, he remarked. You're either very indecisive or very curious. Both, Clara admitted cheerfully. And proud of it. He shook his head, suppressing a smirk as he began ringing up the books. You do realize these will take you weeks to get through? Oh, I doubt that, she said, leaning on the counter. I read quickly. It's a habit I picked up as a kid. Books were my escape when the world felt too big and scary. The words slipped out so casually that Elias nearly missed the weight behind them. He glanced at her, noting the brief shadow that crossed her face before her smile returned. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he found himself wanting to ask more, to learn what lay beneath her sunny exterior. But the moment passed, and he let it. That'll be 47 pounds, he said instead, sliding the stack toward her. Clara pulled out her wallet, handing over the exact amount. As she packed the books into her tote, she glanced at him thoughtfully. Do you ever take a break from this place? She asked. Elias frowned. Why? Because there's a wonderful tea shop just down the road, she said, her tone light but her eyes earnest. And I think you'd enjoy it. It's cozy and quiet, with the best scones you've ever tasted. I'm fine here, he replied curtly, already turning back to his ledger. Clara didn't press the issue. Instead, she slung the tote over her shoulder and gave him one last smile. Well, if you ever change your mind, let me know. I'd be happy to share a pot of tea with you. Elias grunted in acknowledgement, though he didn't look up. When the doorbell jingled again, signaling her departure, he stared at the space she just vacated, a strange hollowness settling in his chest. For the rest of the day, the shop felt quieter than usual, as if her presence had chased away some unseen gloom. And though Elias didn't know it yet, her words about tea and scones would linger in his mind long after the sun had set. Chapter 3. The Pages Between Us. The following week unfurled like the pages of a well-loved book, its narrative sprinkled with vibrant moments and sharp contrasts. Clara found herself returning to the shop daily, each visit a deliberate dance with Elias's prickly demeanor. Her presence was a force that the bookstore hadn't known it needed, a fresh gust of air swirling through the musty corridors of Elias's self-imposed isolation. You're back, Elias muttered one morning as the bell above the door chimed its usual greeting. He stood behind the counter, his glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. His tone was as flat as ever, but Clara noticed the faintest upward twitch of his mouth, a smile in hiding. Did you miss me? Clara teased, placing a reusable canvas bag brimming with books on the counter. Or are you going to pretend that you're tired of my company already? Elias arched an eyebrow. You assume a lot about what I'm pretending. What's in the bag? Books for the community shelf, Clara replied. I noticed you had one in the back corner. It's more for show than use, he said. People like the idea of a community shelf, but no one actually contributes to it. Consider this a contribution, Clara said brightly, nudging the bag closer. And before you grumble about clutter, I've already categorized them. Alphabetically by author. Elias blinked, momentarily disarmed. "You sorted them?" Clara's grin widened. "I'm nothing if not thorough." Their exchanges followed a similar rhythm, a verbal sparring that neither admitted they enjoyed. Each barb and retort was a thread in the tapestry of their developing connection, a collision of two opposing forces that somehow created harmony. Clara's optimism grated against Elias's cynicism, yet it also softened his edges. For her part, Clara found his dry wit and reluctant vulnerability oddly charming. One afternoon, as the rain painted streaks on the shop's front window, Clara discovered a hidden gem on a shelf labeled Forgotten Favorites. She held up the weathered book, its cover faded and spine cracked, and turned to Elias. "How long has this been here?" she asked. He glanced up from the ledger he was updating. "A while." "Why?" "Because this is a first edition of A Field of Stars," she said, her tone tinged with awe. "It's worth a small fortune." Elias shrugged. "It's just paper and ink. Sentimental value aside, books shouldn't be hoarded like treasure." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You don't mean that. Books are treasures. They hold worlds within them, memories, and sometimes they're just clutter." Elias interrupted. "Not every story is worth keeping." Clara set the book down carefully, her expression softening. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as though the conversation had become physically taxing. "Some stories are better left on the shelf, Clara." There it was again. The wall he built so meticulously, the barrier that hinted at pain she didn't yet understand. Clara's curiosity itched at the edges of her restraint, but she knew better than to push. Instead, she changed the subject. "Well, if you won't see its value, maybe someone else will. How about we donate it to a library auction?" Elias's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Do whatever you want." Days later, Clara arrived at the shop to find Elias in the midst of a rare task, rearranging the front display. He was muttering under his breath, trying to balance a precarious stack of hardcover classics. "Need a hand?" she asked, stepping inside and shaking off her umbrella. Elias scowled at the wobbling stack. "It's under control." Clara didn't wait for permission. She stepped up beside him, her hands steadying the books before they could topple. "You're welcome," she said sweetly. He sighed but didn't protest. Together, they reorganized the display, their movements a surprisingly seamless collaboration. Clara hummed softly as she worked, and Elias found himself listening despite himself. When they finished, Clara stepped back to admire their work. "Not bad," she said. "It could use a touch of color, though. Maybe some fresh flowers?" "This is a bookstore, not a florist," Elias replied dryly. "You're impossible," Clara said, shaking her head, but her smile remained, and Elias couldn't help but notice the way it lit up the dim shop. That evening, after Clara had left, Elias sat alone in the quiet of the bookstore. Her energy lingered in the air, an echo that refused to fade. He picked up the first edition of A Field of Stars from where she had left it, running his fingers over the cracked spine. He opened the book and read the inscription on the first page, written in a hand that was achingly familiar. "To Elias, for all the stories we've yet to write. With love, L." Elias closed the book abruptly, his chest tightening. He placed it back on the shelf, his hands trembling slightly. "Some stories," he murmured to himself, "are better left on the shelf." But as he turned off the lights and locked the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was rewriting his story, one chapter at a time. Chapter 4. The Weight of Dusty Tomes. The sunlight crept into Elias's bookshop in hesitant beams, cutting through the dusty air like golden threads. Morning had arrived, heralded by the faint clink of the bell above the door as Clara breezed in. She carried the same energy as a gust of spring air, her arms laden with books that she claimed to have found at a flea market on the edge of town. Elias had come to recognize that spark in her eyes, the way her gaze lit up when she spoke of stories yet unread. These, Clara began, setting the pile on the counter with a thud, are treasures. Look at this one. Leather-bound, gilded edges, and it smells of history. Don't you just love that? She inhaled deeply, as if she could draw the scent of antiquity into her very soul. Elias raised an eyebrow, pausing his ritual of alphabetizing the classic shelf. It smells of mildew and neglect, he replied, though a faint smirk betrayed his enjoyment of her exuberance. You've been frequenting dubious markets again, haven't you? Dubious. Clara feigned offense, clutching her heart theatrically. I'll have you know that these dubious markets are the lifeblood of literary discovery. Besides, she leaned in conspiratorially, you should see the characters who run the stalls. It's like stepping into a Dickens novel. Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his dark eyes catching the light as he absently polished his glasses. Clara's presence had become an enigma to him. Her optimism was like water on parched soil, nourishing and unsettling all at once. He'd spent years wrapping himself in the solitude of his shop, his heart safely walled off behind rows of unread books and unsaid words. And yet here she was, chipping away at his carefully constructed defenses. You've turned this place into your personal library, he muttered, gesturing to the pile of books that now sat beside her usual corner chair. Borrowing isn't a crime, you know. Besides, I always return them, Clara said with a wink. Though, I'll admit, it's tempting to never give some of them back. Elias's smirk turned into a genuine smile, a rare occurrence that startled even him. He cleared his throat and busied himself with the stack of books she brought in, inspecting the titles. They ranged from obscure poetry collections to tattered romances, a testament to her eclectic taste. You're impossible, he muttered, though his tone lacked the bite it once carried. Clara laughed, the sound ringing out like a melody that filled the empty spaces of the shop. And yet, you keep letting me in. What does that say about you, Elias? He didn't answer, his focus ostensibly on cataloging the new arrivals. But her question lingered, its weight pressing against the walls of his mind long after she'd settled into her usual spot, a cup of tea in one hand and a well-worn book in the other. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting amber hues across the shop's wooden floors, Clara's laughter broke the quiet. She was reading aloud from a particularly absurd passage in one of her flea market finds, her voice animated and her expressions exaggerated. Elias, standing behind the counter, couldn't help but be drawn in. Against his better judgment, he allowed himself to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that startled them both. "You're laughing," Clara said, her eyes wide with mock disbelief. "I didn't think you knew how to do that." "Don't get used to it," Elias replied, though the faintest trace of a smile lingered on his face. "Too late. I'm documenting this moment for posterity," she teased, pretending to scribble in the margins of her book. The banter flowed easily between them, like the pages of a well-loved novel turning effortlessly from one to the next. And though Elias tried to maintain the distance he'd grown accustomed to, he couldn't deny the warmth that Clara brought into his otherwise monochrome world. As the day drew to a close, Elias found himself standing at the window, watching Clara leave. She walked with an unhurried grace, her scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon in the wind. He couldn't pinpoint when it had begun, this shift within him. Perhaps it was the way she spoke of books as though they were living, breathing companions. Or maybe it was her ability to find beauty in the mundane, to light up even the darkest corners of his heart. For years, Elias had convinced himself that his world was enough. that the shop and its endless shelves could fill the void left by a lifetime of disappointments. But now, as he watched Clara disappear into the evening haze, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it to stop. The bell above the door chimed softly as he locked up for the night, the sound echoing in the stillness. The shop felt different now, though he couldn't quite place why. All he knew was that, somewhere beneath the dust and the silence, a spark had been lit, and it refused to be extinguished. Chapter 5. Threads of Silver and Gold. The rain fell in a steady cadence, a soft drumbeat against the large windows of Elias's bookshop. The storm had rolled in without warning, the gray sky pressing down on the town like a heavy quilt. Inside the shop, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and fresh tea, a comforting contrast to the chill outside. Clara was perched on her usual seat by the window, a stack of novels beside her and an open book balanced on her knees. Her fingers traced the edge of a page absent-mindedly as she read, her brow furrowing at intervals when she reached particularly moving passages. Elias sat behind the counter, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He tried to lose himself in inventory records, but his eyes kept wandering to the woman in the corner. It had become a pattern. Her visits, their banter, the quiet moments they shared in the shop. He'd stopped questioning why her presence no longer felt like an intrusion. Instead, it had begun to feel like something else, something he couldn't quite name. The bell above the door jangled sharply, interrupting his thoughts. A tall man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his umbrella. He wore a tailored coat and had the polished demeanor of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His sharp gaze swept over the shop, landing first on Clara and then on Elias. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth but tinged with impatience. "I'm looking for Clara Davenport." Clara looked up, startled. "Daniel," she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and unease. She closed her book and rose to her feet, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. "What are you doing here?" Daniel's smile was practiced, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I was in the area on business and thought I'd drop by." Imagine my surprise when I heard you were spending so much time in a little bookshop. Elias's grip tightened around his coffee mug. He couldn't explain the flicker of annoyance that flared in his chest. This stranger, with his polished shoes and condescending tone, didn't belong here. And yet, it seemed he knew Clara well, too well. "I like it here," Clara said, her tone defensive. She glanced at Elias briefly, as if seeking an anchor. "It's peaceful." "Peaceful," Daniel repeated, his gaze sweeping the shop with thinly veiled disdain. "I suppose that's one way to describe it. But Clara, don't you think it's time to come back?" "To get back to," he paused, searching for the right words. "To real life?" Elias set his mug down with a deliberate clink, drawing Daniel's attention. "This is real life," he said, his voice steady but cold. "More real than whatever world you're referring to." Clara's cheeks flushed, a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment coloring her expression. "Elias," she began, but he shook his head slightly, as if to say she didn't need to explain. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And you are?" "Elias Hawthorne," he said, extending a hand. "Owner of this shop." Daniel hesitated before shaking Elias's hand, his grip firm but perfunctory. "Daniel Brooks. A friend of Clara's." "A friend," Elias echoed, his tone neutral but his gaze sharp. How fortunate for her to have friends checking in on her. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken challenges. Clara, sensing the growing unease, stepped between them. "Daniel, thank you for stopping by, but I'm fine here." "Really?" Daniel's expression softened, though it still carried a trace of condescension. "If you say so, Clara." but you know where to find me if you change your mind." With that, he turned and strode out, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. The sound of the rain swallowed his departure, leaving a strained silence in the shop. "I'm sorry about that," Clara said after a moment, turning to Elias. "Daniel means well, but he can be intense." "He's an ass," Elias said bluntly, earning a surprised laugh from Clara. "He's not so bad," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "We used to work together." "He's protective, I suppose." Elias studied her, his dark eyes searching for something unspoken. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "To go back to whatever life he thinks you should be living?" Clara's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful frown. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know that this place feels right. For now, at least." Elias nodded, his gaze softening. "Then stay," he said simply. "This shop has room for one more bibliophile." Her smile returned, bright and genuine. "Thank you, Elias. That means more than you know." As the rain continued to fall, the two of them returned to their respective corners of the shop. The tension lingered, but so did something else. An unspoken understanding, a connection that neither of them could deny. And though neither would say it aloud, they both knew that the day had marked a turning point, one that could not be undone. Chapter 6. Echoes of an Unwritten Past. Elias awoke to a gray morning, the kind of day where the clouds hung low and seemed to press down on the earth. The world outside his small apartment was a monotone smear of wet asphalt and leafless trees, a perfect reflection of the mood he tried to shake off as he sipped his bitter coffee. His thoughts, however, were anything but gray. They danced with fragments of conversations, snippets of laughter, and flashes of Clara's expressive eyes as they had spoken about life, books, and everything in between. Her presence in his bookstore had begun to feel less like a disruption and more like an inevitability. She belonged there in a way he never expected, weaving herself into the fabric of the place and, unsettlingly, into his thoughts. Elias set down his mug and shook his head. He had to be cautious. He couldn't let himself get swept away by the allure of her optimism. It was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. As if summoned by his thoughts, the bell above the bookstore door jingled, heralding Clara's arrival. She stepped in, her scarf a vibrant shade of mustard yellow that stood out like a ray of sunlight against the drab morning. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her breath fogged the air as she greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, Elias. Isn't it a beautiful day?" she asked, as if the oppressive clouds didn't exist. "Beautiful," he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "It looks like the sky forgot how to be anything but miserable." Clara laughed, unbothered by his cynicism. "Oh, but that's the charm of it. Days like these are perfect for curling up with a book and letting the world outside fade away." She stepped closer to the counter, resting her elbows on it as she leaned forward. "Do you ever get lost in books like that, Elias?" He hesitated, the question cutting closer than he liked. "Once," he admitted. "A long time ago." Clara tilted her head, curiosity lighting up her face. "What changed?" "Life," he said simply, his tone closing the door on further inquiry. But Clara wasn't one to let doors stay shut for long. "Life can be hard," she acknowledged softly. "But that's why we need stories, isn't it? To remind us that even in the darkest chapters, there's a chance for something beautiful to happen." Elias's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to tell her that he had once thought the same, that stories had been his refuge, his solace. But those were feelings he had buried deep, and he wasn't ready to unearth them. So instead, he gave a noncommittal shrug and turned his attention to the stack of books he had been sorting. Clara didn't push further. Instead, she wandered into the store, her fingers trailing along the spines of books as if she could feel their stories pulsing beneath her touch. She moved with an ease that contrasted sharply with Elias's carefully maintained walls. He watched her from the corner of his eye, fascinated despite himself. "Have you ever thought about writing your own book?" she asked suddenly, her voice drifting through the quiet store. Elias nearly dropped the book he was holding. "Me? Write a book? That's a laugh." Clara turned to face him, her expression serious. "Why not? You're surrounded by stories every day. You must have so many ideas swirling around in your head." He shook his head. "I'm not a writer, Clara. I'm just a man who sells books. For now," she said, a playful lilt in her voice. "But I think you have more to say than you let on." Her words unsettled him, not because they were unkind, but because they felt too close to the truth. He didn't respond, and Clara let the silence linger, filling it with her presence as she continued to explore the store. The morning passed in a rhythm that was becoming familiar. Clara asked questions about obscure authors and hidden gems on the shelves, and Elias answered with a mix of exasperation and reluctant amusement. She had a way of making even the smallest moments feel significant, as if every book they discussed was a doorway to something greater. When Clara finally left, the store felt emptier than usual. Elias tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to her words. Did he have more to say than he let on? He had spent so long silencing the parts of himself that yearned for connection, for expression. Maybe Clara saw something he couldn't, or wouldn't, see in himself. That evening, as the store's lights cast a warm glow against the encroaching darkness, Elias sat at the counter with a blank notebook in front of him. He stared at the empty pages, his pen hovering uncertainly above the surface. The words didn't come easily, but they came nonetheless, halting and awkward but undeniably his. As he wrote, he thought of Clara and the way she had spoken about stories, about finding beauty even in the darkest chapters. He didn't know if he believed her yet, but for the first time in years, he was willing to try. Chapter 7. Shadows Cast by Love. Elias stood at the counter, absent-mindedly flipping through an old ledger. The numbers swam on the yellowed pages, their meaning lost in the turmoil of his thoughts. The bookstore was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor as he shifted his weight. It was the kind of silence he had once craved, but now it felt oppressive, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break the stillness. Clara hadn't come by in 3 days. Not that he was counting. The usual rhythm of her visits had somehow woven itself into the fabric of his days. Without her, the shop felt dimmer, less alive. He tried to convince himself it didn't matter, but her absence gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't reach. He'd replayed their last conversation more times than he cared to admit. Her laughter, the way her eyes lit up as they discussed Austen's irony or the romanticism of Keats. It all felt too vivid, too real to ignore. And then there was the way she looked at him as she left, a lingering glance that felt like an unspoken question. He'd almost called out to her, but the words had tangled in his throat. A sudden knock at the door startled him. It was late, far past closing time. For a moment, he thought it might be Clara, but when he opened the door, he found himself face to face with someone else entirely. "Elias," the woman said, her voice low and smooth, like the crackle of a record player. It took him a moment to place her. Emma. The name struck him like a shard of glass. She stood there, framed by the glow of the street lamp, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked almost the same as she had the last time he'd seen her, years ago, though there was a hardness to her expression now, a guarded edge that hadn't been there before. "Emma," he said, his voice hollow, "what are you doing here?" "I heard you were still here, still running this little shop," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Thought I'd stop by." Elias closed the door, his hands trembling. He'd always imagined what he might say to her if they ever crossed paths again. But now that she was here, his mind was blank. "Why?" he asked finally, his tone sharper than he'd intended. Emma's gaze swept over the shop, taking in the rows of books and the faint smell of aged paper. "Why not?" she said with a shrug. "I was in town. Thought it might be nice to catch up." Elias frowned. "Catch up? After all this time?" She tilted her head, her lips curving into a small, enigmatic smile. "I didn't expect you to be thrilled to see me. But we had something once, didn't we? Doesn't that count for anything?" He looked away, his chest tightening. Her words stirred memories he'd buried long ago. Quiet afternoons in cafes, whispered dreams of the future, and the eventual shattering of it all. She had left without warning, leaving behind only a note that offered no answers, only more questions. "Why are you really here?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. Emma hesitated, the bravado slipping from her face. I'm sorry, Elias, for how things ended, for leaving the way I did. I've carried that with me for years." He studied her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. Part of him wanted to believe her, to let her apology mend the wound she'd left. But another part, the part that had spent years building walls around his heart, refused to let her in so easily. "It's a little late for apologies," he said finally, his tone devoid of warmth. Emma nodded, as if she'd expected as much. "Maybe it is, but I needed to say it anyway." The silence that followed was heavy, fraught with the weight of things unsaid. Emma shifted on her feet, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned toward the door. "Take care of yourself, Elias," she said softly, and then she was gone, leaving the shop colder than before. Elias stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. He felt hollow, as if her visit had dredged up pieces of himself he'd long thought buried. He wanted to scream, to rage against the ghosts of the past, but instead, he simply walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden beneath it. The burn of the liquid was a welcome distraction, a small anchor in the storm of his emotions. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts drift to Clara. She was everything Emma wasn't: open, honest, and unafraid to confront the world. The thought of her brought a flicker of warmth to his chest, a small reminder that not all connections were destined to end in pain. As the night wore on, Elias resolved to move forward, to let the past remain where it belonged. But even as he made that silent vow, he couldn't help but wonder if Emma's reappearance was a sign of something more, a reminder that the past wasn't as distant as he'd like to believe. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows of the bookstore. Elias poured another glass of whiskey and settled into his chair, the shadows of his memories stretching long into the night. Chapter 8. The Fragile Binding. The following week was a quiet one in Elias's bookstore. The rhythm of everyday life resumed, with the soft creak of the floorboards and the rustle of pages in the background. But something had changed in the air, something delicate, yet undeniable. It wasn't just the weather shifting toward the bitter cold of autumn, or the familiar scent of old paper and dust that seemed to cling to the very bones of the shop. No, it was something more personal, something intangible. Clara. Every time Elias turned a page or arranged a shelf, the memory of her laugh echoed in his mind. The spark in her eyes when she spoke about her favorite novels, the way her fingers lingered over the spine of each book, as though she could feel its history through the leather and ink. He had grown accustomed to her presence, even if he didn't fully understand why. Clara had come in nearly every day since that first encounter, each visit bringing with it a new spark of life to the old, dusty shelves. She never stayed for too long. Always just enough time to scan the aisles, to pull a book from the shelf, to offer a brief exchange of words. but each conversation seemed to draw him closer to something, though he couldn't yet name what it was. It was on a Tuesday, just as the sun was beginning to set and the last light of day filtered through the tall windows, that Clara walked in with a book in hand. This time, she had picked something different, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. She smiled as she approached the counter, her hands gripping the book as if it were a treasure. "This one's for you," she said, her voice soft but brimming with excitement. Elias raised an eyebrow as he took the book from her hands. "For me? I didn't know I needed any more books," he said, his tone dry, but there was no malice behind it, just the familiar shield he always wore. "I thought you might like it," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's about the power of words, and I think you'd appreciate that." Elias paused, staring at the cover for a moment before meeting her gaze. She had a way of seeing him, really seeing him, that made him uncomfortable, yet strangely comforted. Her insight felt like a warm light, something that could melt the walls he'd spent so many years building around himself. "I've read it," he said, almost absent-mindedly, flipping the book open to the first page. "I've always thought words are dangerous. They can lift you up, sure, but they can also tear you down." Clara's expression softened, and she leaned in a little closer. "I used to think the same way, but now, I think words are like bridges. They connect us, even when we're afraid to reach out." There it was again, the way she saw the world, the way she saw him, as though, with each visit, she was chiseling away at the hardened exterior Elias had so carefully sculpted over the years. Elias didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't want to appear weak, but in that moment, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with the book in his hands. "I suppose we'll see," he muttered, trying to hide the unexpected knot forming in his chest. Clara tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You're not alone, she said, her voice quiet but full of something deep and knowing. Elias blinked, startled by the bluntness of her words. "What do you mean by that?" Her smile was gentle, but it held something more, something that made Elias feel both seen and exposed. "You don't have to hide behind the shelves. You don't have to carry that weight by yourself." Elias didn't reply immediately. The words struck a chord deep within him, reverberating through the years of grief and disillusionment he'd buried beneath layers of sarcasm and distance. Clara's words were like a rope, pulling him towards something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But there was something else, something even more pressing. Clara had changed him, but in a way he wasn't sure he was prepared for. She wasn't just some casual customer, some fleeting acquaintance who'd come and gone with the seasons. No, Clara was different. She had become a presence he could no longer ignore, and worse still, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Elias began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm not good at this." She smiled, but there was no judgment in her gaze. "None of us are. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." The words hung in the air for a long moment, neither of them moving. It felt as though the entire world outside the bookstore had faded away, leaving only the two of them standing there, in the quiet, dusty space between the shelves. A connection had formed, subtle but undeniable, and Elias couldn't decide if he wanted to run from it or embrace it. Clara placed the book she had been holding on the counter, her fingers brushing lightly against his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through him, something unfamiliar and thrilling, yet frightening. "I should go," Clara said softly, pulling her hand back and stepping away. "But I'll be back tomorrow, and next week, and the week after that." Elias watched her, his heart pounding unexpectedly. "I'll be here," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. As she left the shop, the doorbell jingling softly in her wake. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring at the book she had left behind. It was as though her presence had left a mark on him, one he couldn't easily wash away. She was right, he realized. Words had power. And Clara, well, Clara had the ability to make him feel like he was part of something more. The evening wore on, and the shop grew quieter. But Elias's mind was anything but still. He thought about her smile, her words, the way she had gently chipped away at his defenses. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let go of the weight he'd been carrying for so long. Maybe he could finally allow himself to believe in something more than the empty pages of the past. The next day came quickly, and Elias found himself waiting, not for a customer, but for Clara. The idea of her returning filled him with an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. But he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He wanted her to walk through that door again. And this time, he wasn't going to hide. Chapter 9. A bookmark in time. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the next, yet Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. Clara had been coming to the bookstore every day, sometimes for hours, and each time, it felt like the space between them closed a little more. He had never been one for deep conversations, nor had he ever cared much for emotional connections, but with Clara, things were different. She made him feel things he wasn't used to feeling, things he didn't know how to handle. It was a Wednesday when she arrived just before noon, as the first soft rays of sunlight filtered through the bookstore windows, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Elias was shelving a new batch of novels when he heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. He turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, her eyes bright as usual, her hands clutching a weathered, leather-bound book. "Morning," she said, her voice light and full of energy. "Morning," Elias replied, his own voice gruff, though the words felt strange on his tongue. It was as though he had been waiting for her all along, but hadn't yet figured out how to express it. She smiled, and Elias couldn't help but notice the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. She had a way of looking at him, not with pity or curiosity, but with something deeper, something that made him feel understood. It was disarming. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Clara continued, her gaze drifting to the shelves around them, "about words being like bridges." Elias nodded, though he didn't quite know where this was going. "And?" She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the spines of books as she walked. "I think I've been building bridges my whole life, connecting people, connecting stories. But I've never really allowed anyone to build a bridge to me." The words hung in the air between them, and Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. For a moment, he wondered if she was speaking about something personal, something deeper than the casual conversation they'd been having. I think I might be the same," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. His eyes darted away from hers, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of his own admission. He had never let anyone get close enough to see the real him, not in years. His past was too complicated, too messy. He preferred it that way. Clara didn't press him, though. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply nodded, as though she understood more than he was saying aloud. "I know you're not really one for talking about feelings," she said softly, "but I want you to know something. I don't expect anything from you. Not right now. Not ever." The simplicity of her words hit Elias harder than he'd expected. She wasn't asking for him to change overnight, wasn't demanding he open up. She simply wanted to be there, quietly, patiently, without expectation. And that, more than anything, was what scared him. The idea that someone could accept him as he was, with all his baggage and unhealed wounds, without wanting him to be someone else. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Why? Why not?" Clara said with a shrug, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I think you're worth knowing, Elias." I think there's more to you than what's on the surface." Elias was silent for a long moment, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what she was offering. She wasn't here for some grand romantic gesture, nor was she looking for validation. She just wanted to see him, and that terrified him. He turned his back on her, pretending to focus on the books in front of him, but Clara didn't leave. Instead, she stood there quietly, waiting for him to speak. Her patience, her understanding, was a gift, and it was something he had never quite known how to receive. "Clara," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. He turned back to face her, his hand gripping the edge of the shelf as if it might hold him steady. "I don't know how to do this. To open up, to let someone in." Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on the counter between them, the same counter where she had left her book the day before. "You don't have to do anything, Elias. You don't have to be perfect. Just be you." The simplicity of her words hit him with unexpected force. Just be you. It felt almost too easy, too unthreatening. And yet, for Elias, it was the hardest thing in the world. He didn't know how to be anything but the person he had spent years becoming. A man who hid behind books, behind sarcasm, behind walls he had built to protect himself from the hurt he feared would come if he let anyone close. And yet, here she was, offering him an escape from that self-imposed prison. "I don't know if I can," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You don't have to know," she said gently. "You just have to take one step at a time." For a moment, there was silence between them, an understanding that neither of them had to speak for the other to know what was on their minds. The tension in the air was thick, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive kind of tension that Elias had always feared. It was lighter, easier to bear, as though they were both standing on the cusp of something they weren't yet ready to define, but both were willing to explore. Clara stepped back, a small sigh escaping her lips as she glanced at the book she had placed on the counter. "Anyway, this one's for you," she said, breaking the silence. "I think you'll like it." Elias glanced down at the book in front of him, still unsure of how to respond, but a small part of him felt lighter, as though, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone in his journey. Clara was right. She wasn't asking for anything more than what was already here. Two people, navigating the delicate steps toward understanding, toward connection. He picked up the book, his fingers brushing against the cover. "I'll read it," he said, though his voice was still rough with emotions he hadn't fully processed. Clara smiled, her eyes sparkling with something unspoken. "I'll be back tomorrow." And with that, she left, the door jingling softly behind her as she disappeared into the cold air outside. Elias stood there for a long moment, his mind spinning, his heart beating a little faster than it had before. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to build that bridge after all. Chapter 10. Under the light of a fading candle. The days that followed Clara's last visit felt different. The air was no longer just filled with the smell of old paper and dust. It carried a weight, a gentle expectancy that Elias couldn't shake. He had spent years building walls around his heart, years convincing himself that love was an illusion for those who dared to believe in fairy tales. But Clara was a different kind of story, one he hadn't seen coming, one that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. The bookstore had never seemed so quiet, despite the usual hum of customers that wandered in and out. Elias had always been content in his solitude, the quiet hum of the shop his perfect companion. But now, it felt as if the silence itself was waiting for something, waiting for him to make a decision, to take a step that had been long overdue. But the weight of it was suffocating. He didn't know if he could let Clara in, if he could expose the fragile parts of himself he had spent years keeping hidden. It was Thursday afternoon when Clara walked in again, her presence like a breath of fresh air. Elias was sorting through a box of newly arrived books when the familiar jingle of the doorbell signaled her arrival. She was early today, he noticed, and as always, she had a book tucked under her arm. This time, it was a small, leather-bound journal. "Elias," she greeted, her voice a soft melody that always seemed to make his heart skip a beat. "Clara," he responded, his voice hoarse. He still wasn't sure how to react to her presence. Was he supposed to act like everything was normal? Or was he supposed to acknowledge the undercurrent of something more that had been growing between them? She made her way to the counter, her eyes scanning the shelves as if she were already familiar with the layout. She had that way of making herself at home no matter where she was, as though every place was a story waiting to be discovered. "I brought you something," Clara said, placing the small journal on the counter between them. She didn't seem to notice the way his breath caught in his throat. "It's a gift." Elias frowned slightly, unsure of what to say. "You didn't have to bring me anything," he murmured, his fingers hovering over the journal without touching it. "I know," Clara said with a smile, "but I thought you might appreciate it. It's a journal I've been writing in for a while. It's a bit of everything, thoughts, quotes, memories. I thought you might find it inspiring." Elias hesitated. He had never been one to keep a journal. His life was his life, and there was no need to document every fleeting moment. But something about the gesture, the personal nature of Clara's gift, made him pause. She had shared a part of herself with him, something tangible, something more than just words. He picked up the journal, feeling the cool leather against his fingers. It was simple, yet elegant, much like Clara herself. He opened it cautiously, scanning the pages. There were drawings, snippets of poetry, and even a few faded photographs. Clara's handwriting was fluid, flowing as if it were an extension of herself. And on the last page, there was a quote: "The most beautiful stories are the ones that are never told aloud." Elias's heart skipped. It felt like a message just for him, a hint at something he hadn't yet understood. Was Clara trying to tell him something without saying it directly? He closed the journal carefully, feeling the weight of the words sink in. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Clara gave a small nod, her smile warm but knowing. "You're welcome. I thought you might like the idea of telling your story in your own way." He looked at her, trying to read her eyes, trying to figure out if she was asking for more. But Clara was an enigma. She didn't push him, didn't ask for things he wasn't ready to give. She simply existed beside him, patiently waiting for him to figure it out. "I'm not much of a writer," Elias admitted, his voice almost too quiet. "I don't know how to put things into words." Clara's gaze softened. "Sometimes, words aren't the only way to tell a story." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so many years convinced that words were the only way to communicate, both the spoken and the unspoken. But Clara was showing him another way, one that didn't require him to explain himself. She was teaching him that love didn't need to be understood in concrete terms. It simply was. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of quiet conversation and comfortable silences. Clara wandered the shelves, sharing her thoughts on different books, while Elias listened more than he spoke, his mind still processing the depth of their interactions. He wasn't ready to admit to himself just how much she had come to mean to him, but it was becoming harder to deny. When the evening arrived, Clara reluctantly gathered her things to leave. "I'll see you tomorrow," she asked, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Elias nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of reluctance at the thought of her walking out of the store. "Tomorrow," he repeated, his voice steady despite the way his heart was racing. She turned to leave, but just before she stepped out the door, she looked back at him one last time. "Elias," she said, her tone softer than before, "I hope you know, it's okay not to have all the answers right now. Sometimes, it's enough to just be." Her words, simple yet profound, echoed in his mind long after the door had closed behind her. Just be. It was the kind of freedom he had never allowed himself to experience, the kind of freedom that Clara had been offering him all along. And in that moment, Elias realized that maybe he was ready to stop fighting it, to stop running from the possibility of something real, something beautiful. He glanced down at the journal she had left behind, the weight of it in his hands a reminder that the pages of his life were still being written, and perhaps, for the first time in a long while, he was ready to start turning those pages. Chapter 11. The Ghost of Her Smile. The days were getting longer, the pale winter light stretching further into the afternoon. But Elias felt as if time had slowed. Since Clara had left the journal with him, a subtle change had come over the bookstore. An unspoken tension, a crackling energy that had nothing to do with the usual bustle of customers. Every time the door swung open, Elias would find himself looking up, half expecting to see Clara walk through the threshold, her easy smile lighting up the room. But she hadn't come back yet. It had been almost a week. Elias tried not to let it bother him. After all, she had her own life, her own commitments, and he couldn't expect her to come by the bookstore every day. But he missed her, more than he cared to admit. She had become a quiet presence in his life, like the turning of a page that kept him turning to the next chapter. But without her, the silence in the shop felt louder, more oppressive. He spent his time putting away new stock, dusting off old books, and rearranging the shelves that had become a familiar routine. But no amount of work could distract him from the thoughts of Clara, the way she looked at him with such understanding, how she seemed to see right through him, yet never pushed him to reveal what he wasn't ready to share. The bell above the door jingled again, and Elias looked up, his heart momentarily quickening. But it wasn't Clara. It was a regular customer, Mr. Finch, the elderly man who came in every Thursday afternoon to browse through the history section. Elias gave him a curt nod and went back to stacking a pile of new arrivals. It was easier that way, avoiding the disappointment of expecting Clara, only to be met with the ordinary. But today felt different. As the afternoon wore on, Elias noticed a sense of anticipation in the air. Perhaps it was because of the heavy clouds gathering outside, the sky promising a storm that would blanket the town in a soft, cold dust. Or maybe it was because he had finally come to a realization that he wasn't ready to let her go, wasn't ready to let the possibility of them fade like a forgotten dream. At exactly 4:30, the door swung open, and Elias glanced up, his pulse catching. There she was, Clara. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the familiar shelves, a look of quiet contentment crossing her face. But when her gaze landed on him, her expression shifted, as if she had been waiting for something, too. "Elias," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made his chest tighten. She took a few steps inside, and he could see that she had come straight from work. Her clothes, simple and practical, still carried the scent of the outside world. Fresh rain, earth, and a trace of something floral. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't quite been prepared for this moment. His eyes lingered on her, as though trying to memorize the way she looked, the way she made the air around her seem a little lighter, a little brighter. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she added, her gaze flitting nervously toward the rows of books as if looking for a reason to break the silence that stretched between them. "No, not at all," Elias replied, forcing a smile. "I was just waiting for you, actually." Clara's eyes softened at his words, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as though the world outside the bookstore had disappeared. There was only the quiet hum of the shop, the rustle of pages turning in the corners of his mind. "I was thinking," Clara began, her voice quieter now, "about the journal I gave you. Did you have a chance to read it? I mean, you don't have to tell me anything about it, but I'd like to know if it meant anything to you." Elias hesitated, his fingers brushing over the leather-bound cover of the journal she had left behind. It had sat on his desk for days, untouched at first, but over the last few nights, he had found himself drawn to it, reading through the words she had shared with him. Some of it was light, funny stories, observations about people she'd met, places she'd been, but others were heavier, more vulnerable. It was clear Clara had poured pieces of herself into that journal, had trusted him with a glimpse of her soul. "I read it," he said finally, his voice low. I don't know, Clara. It was beautiful. You've got a way with words." Clara smiled, a small, self-conscious smile, but Elias could see the glimmer of something in her eyes. Relief, perhaps, or just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her offering hadn't gone unnoticed. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I was hoping you'd understand." "I do," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm just not sure I understand myself sometimes." Clara stepped closer, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing something. "You don't have to understand it all right now. Sometimes you just have to let things be, to trust that they'll make sense eventually." Elias felt something stir inside him at her words, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. It was a mix of longing, fear, and a strange sense of relief. Maybe he had been looking for something in all the wrong places. Answers, certainty, control. But Clara was showing him that sometimes it was enough to just be, to accept the uncertainty. He cleared his throat, not sure how to continue. The air between them had thickened, charged with the weight of what was unsaid. And he knew, in that moment, that something was about to change. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual, "about us. About how things are between us." Clara's gaze softened, but she didn't speak right away, as though waiting for him to finish. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the words come slower than he would have liked. "I've spent a long time hiding from a lot of things. From people, from emotions. But with you, I feel like I'm starting to come out of the dark. I don't know where this is going, but I don't want to push you away." Her eyes held his for a long moment, and he saw something flicker there, something he couldn't quite name. But it wasn't fear. It was understanding. And perhaps, in that understanding, there was hope. Clara stepped closer, her hand reaching for the journal that lay between them. "You don't have to push me away, Elias. I'm not asking you to have all the answers, or to make a decision right now. I just want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you decide, whatever happens." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight far heavier than any promise could. She wasn't asking him to fix himself, to become something he wasn't. She was simply offering him the space to be, to let their story unfold in its own time. A long while, Elias felt ready to turn the page. Chapter 12, Cracks in the Spine. The storm had arrived, quietly at first, as though testing the world outside before it unleashed its full fury. The sky darkened rapidly, the sun swallowed by heavy clouds, leaving behind only the cold, biting wind that rattled the windows of the bookstore. Elias watched the snowflakes swirl past the glass, each one unique, each one vanishing before it could settle. Inside, the shop was warm. The familiar scent of old paper and coffee filled the air, and the soft hum of the heater created a comforting backdrop to the otherwise quiet afternoon. It was just Elias and Clara now, the two of them surrounded by the pages of countless stories. Clara had stayed longer than she usually did. After their conversation about the journal, there had been no rush to leave. Instead, they had settled into a comfortable silence, a space between them that felt less like distance and more like a bridge. She had wandered through the aisles, picking up books now and then, her fingers brushing over the spines as though finding old friends in the pages. It was a quiet exploration, a shared understanding that neither of them had to speak to communicate. But the storm outside was growing fiercer, and Elias knew that it was time for them to confront the unspoken words that lingered like the shadows in the corners of the room. The words he had been too afraid to say before, the ones that had been building in him ever since she had walked into his shop all those weeks ago. "Clara," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but the weight of what he was about to say hung in the air like a promise. "Can we talk about us?" She turned to him, her gaze soft but curious. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no uncertainty. She had been waiting for this, just as he had. "Of course," Clara replied, setting the book she had been looking at down carefully on the counter. She took a step closer, her presence grounding him. "What's on your mind?" Elias swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the edge of the counter. The storm outside seemed louder now, the wind howling as it slammed against the building. But inside the bookstore, it was just the two of them, just the soft sound of Clara's breath and the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "I don't know how to say this," he admitted, his voice rough, "but I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about me, about us. And I think I'm scared." Clara's expression softened, her lips curving into a small, understanding smile. She stepped closer, closing the space between them until there was only a whisper of air between their bodies. Her hand reached out, touching his gently, as though grounding him in the moment. "You don't have to be scared, Elias," she said, her voice tender. "We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can figure this out together." The simplicity of her words was both a comfort and a challenge. Elias had spent so many years hiding from the things that scared him. His fears, his regrets, his broken heart. But Clara wasn't asking him to fix anything. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She was just asking him to be there, to be real. And for the first time in a long time, Elias wanted to be real. "I know," he murmured, taking a deep breath, "but it's just... I've spent so long building walls around myself. It's easier that way, you know? It's easier to hide, to not care, to not let anyone in." His fingers tightened around hers, grounding himself in her warmth. "But then you came along, and you made me see things differently." Clara's smile widened, and Elias could see the quiet joy in her eyes. She wasn't judging him, wasn't rushing him to say the words he wasn't ready to say. Instead, she was simply present, simply there. And that, Elias realized, was more than he had ever allowed himself to ask for. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you had to change," she said softly. "I just wanted you to see that there's more to life than the walls we build around ourselves. That there's more to love than just what we let ourselves believe." Elias nodded, his throat tight. "I've been afraid of love, Clara. I've been afraid of letting myself feel anything, because every time I did, it ended in disappointment, in pain. But with you, the words hung between them, unfinished but clear. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes never leaving his. She understood. "I don't know if I'm ready to jump into something new," he continued, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "But I do know that I'm tired of running from it. From you. From what could be. I don't want to be scared anymore." Clara's gaze softened, and she reached up, her hand brushing against his cheek. The touch was light but grounding, as though she was anchoring him in this moment, in the possibility of what lay ahead. "We don't have to rush, Elias," she said gently. "We don't need to have everything figured out. We just need to trust. To take things one step at a time." Elias closed his eyes at the warmth of her touch, feeling the weight of everything he had been holding on to begin to lift. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty. All of it started to fade, like fog lifting in the morning light. When he opened his eyes again, he found Clara standing before him, not as a stranger, not as a force that had pushed him to confront his past, but as someone who had quietly and patiently become a part of his future. A future that, for the first time in a long time, felt possible. "All right," he said softly, the words feeling like a promise, a beginning, one step at a time. And with that, the storm outside seemed to quiet. The snow fell gently now, settling into a soft blanket over the world. Inside the bookstore, the air felt different, lighter somehow, as though the world had opened up just a little bit wider, just enough for them to step into it together. Chapter 13. The Library of Lost Hearts. The following week passed in a quiet, almost surreal rhythm. It was as though the world outside had settled into a peaceful slumber, the storm of the previous evening having left behind an odd stillness. But for Elias, the changes were anything but quiet. Each morning, he awoke to a sense of anticipation that had once felt foreign to him, like the first few notes of a song that had been buried for too long. Clara had become a part of his days in ways that were both familiar and new. She still visited the bookstore every afternoon, her presence filling the space with lightness and laughter. But there was something different now, a kind of unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need to say much. The moments they shared spoke volumes. Their conversations were punctuated by laughter and quiet pauses, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from truly knowing someone. Elias had started to let his guard down, little by little. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, after all. But Clara never pushed him. She simply stood by him, letting him come to her at his own pace. And that, Elias had realized, was exactly what he needed. Someone who wasn't asking for more than he could give, but also someone who wasn't willing to settle for less. Today, Clara had stayed later than usual, a stack of books she'd borrowed in her arms as she stood near the counter, flipping through a worn-out copy of The Secret Garden. Her fingers traced the pages absent-mindedly, but Elias could tell her mind was elsewhere. "You're awfully quiet today," he remarked, leaning against the counter. The words came out without thought, the usual edge of cynicism softened by the warmth of the moment. Clara glanced up, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Just thinking," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You know, about everything." Elias raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't used to hearing Clara speak like this, thoughtful, introspective. It was a side of her that he had yet to see in full. About what, exactly? She closed the book, setting it down carefully on the counter before meeting his gaze. "About us," she said quietly, her voice so steady, so sure. "And what comes next?" Elias felt a strange, knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to it. The future had always been a blurry concept for him, something he had avoided looking at too closely. But Clara was asking him to face it, to step into it with her. And for the first time, he didn't want to shy away from it. "I don't know what comes next," Elias admitted, his voice thick with the vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to see. "But I know that I want to be with you. More than I've ever wanted anything." Clara's smile deepened, and she stepped closer to him, her presence warm and steady. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm, grounding him in the moment. "That's enough," she said softly. "We don't have to have everything figured out. We just need to be honest with each other, Elias, and trust that whatever comes, we'll face it together." He swallowed hard, nodding, feeling the weight of her words sink deep into his chest. She was right. They didn't have to know what the future held. They just had to take it one step at a time, together. "I can do that," he said, the words coming easier now. He could feel something shifting inside him, like a weight lifting from his shoulders. The fear that had once consumed him, that had kept him locked in his self-imposed isolation, was beginning to fade. And in its place, something else was taking root. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the promise of something better. "I'm glad," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. because I think we have something worth holding on to." The words hung in the air between them, sweet and heavy with meaning. Elias didn't need to say anything else. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet certainty that had always been there, even when he had been too blind to see it. They had found something rare in each other, something worth fighting for. And as long as they kept holding on to that, they would be all right. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor of the bookstore. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to fade into the background as the two of them stood in their own little world. Elias had no idea what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that, but he knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was no longer afraid of it. Later that evening, after the shop had closed and the last of the customers had trickled out, Elias found himself standing by the front door, looking out at the night. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the streets eerily empty under the blanket of white. Clara had already left, her smile lingering in his mind long after she had gone. He was alone again, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like a moment of reflection, a chance to breathe and think about everything that had happened in the past few weeks. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt full, in a way. Full of possibilities, full of hope, full of the kind of love he hadn't known he was capable of. He took a deep breath and turned away from the door, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As he made his way to the back of the store to close up for the night, he glanced at the shelves around him, the books that had always been his refuge. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to hide behind them. He didn't need to lose himself in stories anymore. He had found his own story, one that was still unfolding, one that he would write alongside Clara. With a smile, he flicked off the light and closed the door behind him, ready to face whatever the next chapter held. Chapter 14. Between the Lines of Forever. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet moments, shared smiles, and conversations that stretched long into the evenings. Elias had long since given up his need for solitude. Clara had become a fixture in his life, like the books that lined the shelves around him. And with each passing day, the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself seemed to crumble a little more, replaced by the warmth of something he had never allowed himself to feel: belonging. Their relationship was no longer just a simple dance of opposites. It was a partnership. They had fallen into a rhythm, a harmony that had grown naturally, like the pages of a book turning chapter by chapter. At times, their differences still made themselves known, but they no longer felt like barriers. Instead, they were pieces of the puzzle that made them who they were. Where Elias had once seen his cynicism as a defense mechanism, he now saw it as something he could laugh at. And Clara, with her boundless optimism, had learned to temper her hope with reality, though not without the occasional playful reminder of how much she believed in the good of the world. It was a chilly Saturday morning when the idea first came to Elias, as he stood behind the counter, watching Clara pore over a collection of antique novels she had found in the back of the store. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the scene, but it was more than the light that filled the room. It was a sense of peace, the kind of peace he had never imagined he could find. "Do you ever wonder?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the silence. "How many lives these books have touched?" Clara looked up, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "All the time," she replied, her smile gentle. "Books are like little windows into the souls of others. Every page turned is a new life lived." Elias nodded, the thought lingering in his mind. The bookstore had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the world of others. But now, it felt like something more. It felt like home, not just for him, but for Clara as well. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice lower now, more contemplative, "about the bookstore, about what it could be." Not just for us, but for everyone. Clara tilted her head, curiosity lighting her features. What do you mean? Elias paused, taking a deep breath, as though he were weighing the idea in his mind. What if we opened the store to more than just books? What if we used it as a space for community? A place for people to come together. Not just to buy stories, but to create their own. Clara's eyes widened in surprise, and Elias could see the spark of excitement igniting in her. You mean like a place for readings, events, maybe even workshops? Exactly, Elias said, a grin tugging at his lips. A place where people can share their stories, their voices, where they can learn, create, and connect. Clara stood up, the energy of the idea already lifting her spirit. That sounds incredible. It's not just about selling books anymore, Elias. It's about making this place something bigger, something that brings people together. Elias felt a warmth spread through him at her enthusiasm. He had never thought of it that way before. The idea had always been there, lingering in the back of his mind, but Clara had given it shape, made it real. And suddenly, the bookstore wasn't just a place he ran. It was a space that had the potential to change lives. We could start small, he mused, maybe a book club or a local author night. Something simple to begin with, but the possibilities are endless. Clara's smile widened, and she took a step toward him, her eyes bright. I love it. I really do. Elias felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of gratitude and hope. For the first time in a long time, he saw his future clearly, a future that no longer felt isolating or uncertain. It was a future that included Clara, included the bookstore, and now included something larger. A vision that could transform not just his life, but the lives of others. Later that week, they sat down together, sketching out plans for their first event. It felt surreal, sitting across from Clara, brainstorming ideas that felt like they were born out of their shared connection. They decided to start with a simple reading, perhaps inviting a local author to showcase their work. They'd set up a cozy corner in the store, complete with mismatched chairs and warm lighting, a place where people could gather and listen to stories come to life. The preparation brought them closer, each idea they discussed adding another layer to the foundation of what was becoming their shared dream. As they worked, Elias found himself thinking back to the man he had been just a few months ago. The man who had shut himself away in the dusty corners of his bookstore, convinced that love and connection were things for other people. He could hardly recognize that man now. In his place stood someone who believed, for the first time in years, in the possibility of change. When the day of the event arrived, Elias was a bundle of nervous energy, pacing the store as Clara prepared in the back. He had never done anything like this before, had never opened up his store to anyone beyond the casual customer or the occasional friend who stopped by. But today, he wasn't just opening the doors to books. He was opening them to a community. And the thought of that, of what it could mean for the future, filled him with both excitement and trepidation. The first guests began to trickle in, the buzz of conversation filling the store. Clara greeted each one with her usual warmth, and Elias stood by the counter, watching it all unfold. His heart raced, but he couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. This was it, the beginning of something new. The reading went smoothly, the author's voice capturing the audience's attention as Clara watched from the sidelines, her eyes glowing with pride. Elias, too, found himself caught up in the magic of the moment. The bookstore was no longer just a place to hide away. It was a place where stories were shared, where lives intersected, and where connections were made. By the time the evening drew to a close, the room was filled with chatter and laughter, people lingering to discuss the reading or simply enjoy the company of others. Elias found himself standing by the door, watching it all with a sense of contentment he had never known. He had built something beautiful, with Clara by his side. And as the last of the guests left, Clara approached him, her smile wide and full of joy. "Look at what we've created," she said, her voice full of wonder. Elias took her hand, squeezing it gently. "No, look at what you've created." Together, they stood in the soft glow of the store, surrounded by the books that had brought them together and the people whose stories they had just begun to weave into their own. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt truly alive, his heart open, his future bright. The chapter he had once feared had turned into something he could never have imagined. And for the first time, he was ready to turn the page. Chapter 15. The final chapter begins. The months that followed the success of their first event seemed to blur into a whirlwind of activity. The bookstore had transformed into something vibrant, alive with the hum of conversation, the rustle of pages turning, and the laughter of people sharing stories. Elias couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. The bookstore, once a quiet sanctuary of solitude, had become the heart of a growing community. And Clara, she had become his co-conspirator, his partner in every sense of the word. Their second event had been just as successful as the first, and soon, more followed. Book clubs formed, writers' workshops blossomed, and every corner of the store seemed to have a new purpose. People came in for more than just books. They came for the connections, for the sense of belonging that Elias and Clara had created together. It was a place where dreams were born, where new stories were written, and where the past was sometimes revisited through the pages of old novels or the quiet exchange of memories. One evening, as the store closed and the last few stragglers made their way out, Elias stood behind the counter, his eyes scanning the shelves as Clara tidied up. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that comes from months of shared work, laughter, and growth. The air was still warm from the late summer evening, and the faint scent of old books lingered in the air, mixing with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Clara, humming softly to herself, approached him, wiping her hands on a towel. She had always had a way of making even the simplest tasks seem effortless. The way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she looked at him. It all made the bookstore feel like something more than just a business. It felt like home. "I was thinking," Clara began, her voice light but filled with the familiar spark of excitement. "What if we took the bookstore even further? Maybe we could start a publishing project, something small, a way to help local writers share their stories with the world." Elias looked up from the counter, his brow furrowing in thought. The idea was bold, and he could see the enthusiasm in Clara's eyes. They had always talked about pushing the boundaries of what the bookstore could be, but this felt like another leap altogether. "A publishing project?" he repeated, turning the thought over in his mind. "You mean we help people publish their own books?" Clara nodded eagerly. "Yes, think about it. We've met so many talented writers and creatives through the events. Some of them have stories that deserve to be told, but they might not know where to start. What if we offered them a platform, a way to publish their work without having to go through the traditional route? We could offer guidance, resources, and support to help them bring their stories to life." Elias felt a surge of excitement, though it was tempered with a hint of nervousness. The bookstore had already become something so much more than he had ever imagined, and now Clara was suggesting they expand even further. But despite the uncertainty, something about the idea felt right. Something about it felt like the next step in their journey. "I like it," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "It's ambitious, but maybe that's exactly what we need." Clara beamed, and for a moment, Elias allowed himself to feel the weight of the decision. They were on the cusp of something new, something bigger than anything they had done before. It was a risk, but it was a risk he was willing to take, especially with Clara by his side. "Let's do it," he said, his smile matching hers. "Let's make it happen." The days that followed were filled with planning and organizing, the excitement palpable in the air. Clara took charge of the logistics, drawing up a plan for how the publishing project could work, while Elias focused on the more practical aspects, the finances, the book selection process, the legalities. It was a huge undertaking, but they had never been more motivated. They decided to start small, focusing on local writers with stories that resonated with the spirit of their community. They would offer self-publishing services, but also provide mentoring and editorial guidance to help the writers shape their work into something truly special. It would be a place where creativity thrived, where stories could be told on their own terms, without the constraints of the traditional publishing world. As the weeks went on, the first few writers came forward, eager to take part in the new project. There was something magical about watching their visions take shape. Stories that had once lived only in their minds were now becoming real, tangible things. Each manuscript that came through their doors felt like a new adventure, a new journey to embark on. One of the first writers to join their project was Emily, a young woman who had been coming to their book events for months. She had always been quiet, reserved, but Elias had sensed a fire in her when she spoke about her writing. Her story was about loss and healing, a powerful tale of love and grief. And when she handed over her manuscript, Elias could see the hope in her eyes. She had taken a chance, trusted them with her work, and now it was their responsibility to help her bring it to the world. The process was slow at first. There were editing meetings, brainstorming sessions, and countless revisions. But with each step, Elias and Clara felt the weight of the project settle more comfortably into their lives. They were creating something bigger than themselves, something that could change lives, just as their bookstore had. It was a late afternoon when Emily came into the store to discuss the final draft of her book. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the room. Clara was busy in the back, but Elias had invited Emily to sit with him at the counter, where they could talk privately. "I think it's ready," Emily said, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I think it's time." Elias looked at the manuscript in front of him, the culmination of Emily's hard work and passion. He nodded slowly. "I agree," he said, feeling a surge of pride. "This is something special. Your story is going to resonate with so many people." Emily's eyes shone with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you both," she said. "You've helped me believe in my story, believe in myself." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "That's the power of stories," he said softly. "They help us believe in each other." As Emily left the store that evening, a sense of fulfillment washed over him. The bookstore was no longer just a business. It was a catalyst for change. It had become a place where dreams could grow, where stories could find their way into the world, and where people could find hope in the pages of a book. Elias stood by the counter, looking out the window at the fading light. Clara was organizing some of the new arrivals on the shelves, humming contentedly to herself. He had never imagined that the bookstore would lead him here, to this place of growth and transformation. He had never imagined that love could feel so much like this, like the turning of a page, the beginning of something new. And as he watched Clara move about the store, her energy a constant source of inspiration, Elias knew one thing for certain. The story was far from over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 16. A story without an ending. The autumn breeze swept through the trees outside the bookstore, the leaves swirling like golden confetti, settling softly on the cobbled street. Inside, the warmth of the store offered a contrast to the crispness of the season. The scent of fresh ink and old paper hung in the air, a reminder of the stories that lived within these walls. Elias stood by the window, looking out at the changing world. It was a world he had once felt detached from, but now, it was a world full of possibility. Since launching their publishing project, life had been a whirlwind of activity. The bookstore had become a beacon of creativity, a hub where writers and readers alike came to find connection. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and new challenges. It was exhilarating, but at times it felt overwhelming. Yet, with Clara by his side, it had become a journey worth every moment. Clara had been his constant, his partner in every sense. Her enthusiasm, her passion for stories, her belief in people, it had all transformed not just the bookstore but his own outlook on life. She had made him believe in the magic of second chances, in the power of love and trust. And now, as he stood watching the sunset, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. "Elias, are you planning to watch the entire sunset? Or should I start brewing some tea?" Clara's voice broke through his reverie, warm and familiar. Elias turned to find Clara standing in the doorway of the back room, her arms crossed casually as she leaned against the frame. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, her smile playful. "Maybe a little of both," he said, smiling in return. "It's just hard to believe how much has changed. This time last year, I would have never imagined any of this." Clara chuckled, walking over to him. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I think we're both guilty of underestimating what's possible when you have the right people by your side." Elias met her gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was right. He had underestimated the potential of their partnership, the strength of their bond. Together, they had turned the bookstore into something far beyond what either of them had envisioned. It wasn't just a place of books anymore. It was a sanctuary for dreamers, a community of writers, readers, and creators who shared a common love for stories. But it wasn't just the bookstore that had flourished. Their relationship had blossomed too. The trust they had built, the way they had come to understand each other's quiet moments and loud ones, had become the foundation of something lasting. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was real, and it was theirs. Clara's voice softened. "I was thinking," she began, her fingers tracing a small pattern on his sleeve, "maybe we should take a break soon. Just the two of us. No books, no deadlines, just time for ourselves." Elias raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A break? Huh? You mean from all of this?" He gestured to the bustling bookstore, the phone buzzing in the corner with messages from new writers interested in their project. She nodded. "Yes, maybe a weekend getaway? Somewhere quiet, where we can breathe. We've both been running nonstop, and I think we've earned it." Elias thought for a moment. A break. The idea felt foreign, but not unwelcome. They had worked tirelessly, pouring their hearts into the bookstore and their publishing project. Maybe a little distance from it all was exactly what they needed. After all, they had spent so much time building something that they had almost forgotten the importance of nurturing themselves, their connection, outside of work. "I think that sounds perfect," Elias said, his voice sincere. "Where do you have in mind?" Clara smiled. "I've been researching a small cabin in the woods, not too far from here. Quiet, cozy, with a view of the lake. No distractions. Just you, me, and maybe a couple of good books." Elias laughed softly. "That sounds like heaven." The next weekend, they set off for the cabin Clara had found, leaving the bustle of the bookstore behind. The drive was peaceful, the landscape unfolding before them like a canvas of golden fields and dense forests. As they neared their destination, the air grew cooler, the sky darker with the promise of evening. It felt like they were entering another world entirely, a place untouched by deadlines, by expectations, by the noise of everyday life. The cabin itself was nestled at the edge of a small lake, surrounded by towering trees that whispered in the wind. It was exactly as Clara had described, a quiet retreat with a rustic charm that made it feel like stepping into a dream. Inside, the wooden walls were lined with bookshelves, and the crackling fireplace cast a warm, flickering glow across the room. It was the perfect place to unwind, to reconnect, to simply be. For the first time in what felt like ages, they didn't rush. They spent the evening by the fire, sipping hot tea and talking about everything and nothing. There were no agenda, no tasks to complete, just the sound of their voices and the comfort of each other's presence. Later, as the night deepened and the sky outside became a blanket of stars, they found themselves lying on the soft rug in front of the fireplace. Clara's head rested on Elias's chest, her hand entwined with his. "I never thought I'd end up here," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I never thought I'd find a place like this, or someone like you." Elias ran his fingers through her hair, the tenderness of the moment enveloping them both. "I never thought I'd find someone like you either," he admitted. "Someone who makes me believe in love again, who makes me feel like anything is possible." Clara lifted her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the firelight. "I think we're just getting started, Elias. There's so much more ahead of us." And for the first time, Elias truly believed her. Their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning, a new chapter waiting to be written. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Elias pulled Clara closer, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart against his. In that moment, surrounded by the peace of the world outside, he knew that no matter where their story took them, they would always have each other, and that was enough.